just told Doug he has a hard job, and as we switch between, he just kind of stands up, and one of us gets up and walks up here, and the other sits down. So he's working hard. The first thing I like to do is thank the group we work with. There was a lot of really good discussion and good dialogue, and we kept things moving along. So I want to thank everybody who was in our group for the feedback they had. The other thing I do recognize is I'm pretty much was standing between this group and the reception, so I will be brief. I could be as brief as stand up here and say ditto, because I think a lot of the things that both Brad and Chad have summarized already are a lot of the things that we talked about in our group also. We were kind of joking within our group because there was a common answer to many of the questions and many of the folks, but it sounds like it was the same thing in both the other groups, is it depends. It depends on who the audience is. It depends on which element you're talking about, which geography you're talking about. So it depends on many different levels is how you answer these questions. So I think as the planning committee starts putting together the report from this forum, they got a huge challenge, David, in front of them to try to figure out what's the exact question or audience we're trying to address. So I think that's one of the things. What I did is from our group, please, as we go through here, if I leave out something you feel is really important, what I did was try to summarize in flip charts from the 4 or 5 flip charts from each one of the questions we had to touch base on those. With the first one with the defining the coastal summary, and I'm sure you can't read these in the back of the room, is maybe it's the limit of the tidal influence, the salt or tidal infusion elements of it. And gets back to it depends. Are we talking local zoning? Is it habitat, water quality? We really need to define for what purpose we're focused on and what we're talking about. One of the other topics that came out was we must continue to monitor and map. However we define it, the coastal zone, it's going to change over time. So as time goes on, if it's a line on a map, that line is going to move. But also I think it's not as much as the line on the map, it's also as we evolve and adapt and things change, our definitions and our focus is getting back to the idea of it depends. Is also going to change over time. So it's something we need to continue to focus on. One other definition is it's not just the coast. Maybe it also includes the watersheds that drain to the coast. Now, maybe it's not the Mississippi River watershed, but what level of watershed drains to the coast that we want to include in that definition of what's the coastal zone and what's the impacts. But one thing we agreed on too, or discussed, was it needs to also discuss and include the infrastructure that's associated with the coastal zone. There are a lot of other things. I was just kind of capturing some of the high points here. Before I go on, does anybody in the group want to add anything to this one? With the hazards and the threats, talked about that, and a lot of this goes into the climate change discussion, that we're starting to see more storms, more frequent large storms that are occurring. As Chad was just saying, that Bill was talking about the number of 500-year storms in a 2-year period. We're seeing these more and more often. Whether what the causes of it you may want to argue about or people may want to argue about, but the fact is we're seeing more intense and more frequent storms. We need to address them. Lack of action is a real threat out there, of people not wanting to do something. Hazard to the financial. Financial from a standpoint, can we continue to afford as a nation this level of disaster assistance? The billions of dollars that went into Katrina, the $60 billion for Sandy, what's going to be the multi-billion-dollar storm next year. Larry this morning talked about Hurricane Andrew missing Miami. How many billions of dollars would that have been if it had went into Miami? Or Houston, or pick your large metropolitan area that we have these billion-dollar disasters. Then there's also the loss of the economic services and other services from our communities that we lose. being a real threat here. But also it's to the impacts to jobs, businesses, homes. But we also talked a little bit about the impacts of water supplies from both a surface water and a groundwater. As our coasts retreat and where's the saltwater line at, it starts to affect water supplies and freshwater water supplies. That's going to become a big issue. While we didn't directly talk about it, I think a lot of people are aware you get in the Midwest or out west and we have water wars. Well, are we going to start seeing water wars along our coastal areas because of freshwater supplies? And one very succinct summary was we got the wrong stuff in the wrong place. And it really leads to some really unintended consequences. And probably one of the biggest threats we have to the coastal zone, however we defined it, is Homo sapiens. It's people. And what we do or don't do and what our interactions are is one of the biggest hazards and threats that we have to the coastal zone. And one of the other things is in our decision is the use of uncertainty or the unknown as a reason for inaction. Deciding that we're not going to do something because we don't have it defined to a fine tooth or a fine point on it. Well, we'll just keep studying it until we're ready to do something. That lack of inaction is going to become a problem in the future. The other parts of that thread is also from special interest groups and also from politicians. Special interest groups, and we had a little short discussion about how do we define special interest groups, and I suggested, as from our point of view here today or the next day and a half, is we're focused on flood loss reduction, both to people and property. So I would say the special interest groups that run counter to that mission or that focus would be the special interest groups that we would be concerned about, and maybe it's through education or other things we need to think about. Because as somebody pointed out, we could be considered a special interest group. So we need to think about that. And then it's always our famous folks that we all like to pick on, but also is our politicians. Politicians many times, whether federal, state, local, making short-term decisions. And we get to that a little bit here in a minute, talking about how we make short-term decisions instead of thinking of long-term impacts and what that means. And how do we educate our politicians to maybe make better decisions when we start thinking about our coastal zones and our environment and the ecosystems. Gotta love these big Post-it notes. When we started talking about risk, we started talking about the loss of balance between economic development and the protection of natural beneficial functions. A little bit what I was just talking about, making those short versus long-term decisions. We want to have the economic development. We want to have the increased tax base. But don't always think about what the losses are to the natural beneficial functions. What are the long-term issues, and are we making our communities more or less resilient as we pursue the economic development that we're all looking for, and especially in this economy. While everybody says it's getting better, it's a slow slog still. So folks are more interested in rebuilding their communities and their tax base and generating revenue maybe than they are thinking long-term resiliency for their communities. Impacts to other sectors behind the coast, and I know both Chad and Brad talked about this, so it was mentioned in the other groups, is while we focus on the coast, it was talked about, I think Margaret mentioned this morning, I think 60% of our economy relies on the coast. So as a nation, it's not just that thin band along the coast that we're focusing on. The ripple effects across the economy and across the nation have to be considered and thought about as a legitimate risk. We can't think of as just as those, and we talked about it too, is those rich people that are on the coast that they can afford to build that beach home. That's not necessarily who we're talking about. We're also talking about folks who have goods or services that they need to export through a coastal port. If that port's not there or it can't function, those goods and services aren't getting sold. The other thing is draining resources from other priorities. as we invest billions of dollars into disaster assistance or even mitigation. As we make those priorities and those decisions about priorities, some things are not getting done. What are those things we're not going to focus on the risk for the coastal zone? A real risk of just clinging to the status quo and doing nothing. And if that's driven because we don't have enough information or we don't have the resources but doing nothing probably is not an answer. While it is an option, it's probably not the one that the nation should pursue. We talked about, and it sounds like it was discussed, and actually the zombie apocalypse was mentioned in our group also, is social unrest and socioeconomic impacts. Unrest from a standpoint of not necessarily as much as the economy falling apart type of thing, which is always a possibility, but also from haves and have-nots, from one community getting treated one way and another community getting treated another and not having equality over it. I think it was discussed during the panel this morning of New Jersey and New York is, well, you did it in Katrina, you're damn well going to do it for me. Can we continue having that dialogue? And to Larry's point this morning was the time to have that discussion isn't when we're responding, it's between the disasters. So now is when we want to be having those discussions and making those expectations about what people should expect when a Katrina or Sandy visits them. And another risk is we don't make decisions quickly in this country. It takes us a long time for change. And part of that's to the nature of our political processes. We do not have that benevolent dictatorship where things happen by the snap of a fingers. While it can be a muddy, ugly process, it takes time to get to those answers. So it's never too soon to start because it's going to take a long time, whatever's decided to be put in place, because it just does. And that's just the way our politics and our political system's set up. By the way, I still think it's the best one in the world, but it's ugly, dirty, and messy at times. I think that was the summary of what we discussed in our group, but I would like to, anybody in our group who wanted to add something else, please feel free.
Yes, Joanne. Yeah. You mentioned unintended consequences, but you didn't give it the name. It was the Jello effect.
Oh.
The name of that, which was
yes.
Jello effect.
Yes. You push one spot and it wiggles somewhere else, and you may not know where it's going to wiggle. So.
And I don't remember who attributed that to.
I think that was Tim Murphy. Not that we're attributing anything, Tim. Anybody else have anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much. And again, I want to thank our group.